Welcome everyone to sharing the slide deck for week 6. It's in a course shell. So this evening's class mainly we're going to focus on the IEP or the Individualized Education Program, also free and appropriate public education, often referred to as FAPE, and then also least restrictive environment. So the first slide shows a chart or a graph on here that shows basic required IEP team members. That would be the student's parents, the special education teacher, general ed teacher, representing that part of the educational process, and then representatives from the LEA or the local education agency, often being a building level principal. Additional team members would include the educational professional that can interpret the evaluation results, such as the school psychologist or the school psychometrist. To the right-hand side, column here shows responsibilities of each person. So obviously with the students' parents, we want them to be active participants in all discussions, provide meaningful input towards goals and objectives written into the plan, and also provide any information regarding the child's strengths and weak areas that need to be addressed. Special education teacher, we often rely on them as an expert in specifically designing instruction for each individual student based on the accommodations and modifications needed to provide adequate educational services. The general education teacher, for those students that are participating in the general education classroom setting, often referred to as a curriculum specialist, so they can provide the core academic instruction and then implement any accommodations and modifications that are determined. And then the LEA representative or the building administrator, also, they are there to basically provide supervision, making sure that provisions are adequately implemented. They're specifically designed for instruction for the student, basically have working knowledge of the general education curriculum, and then also present information about the availability of resources for the LEA that may need to be provided. So with the individualized education program, we have the IEP document itself, often referred to as a legally binding document. It's a contract between the school and the parent. It's a fluid document, meaning that we can go in and make changes as needed, do an annual review, and address all areas of concern. Next area when we're looking at IEP is maintaining that confidentiality, making sure information is kept confidential. The IEP document itself is kept locked up. It's not open and readily available for anybody just to walk in, pick up, and look at. FERPA is the confidentiality for all students, and that's the main purposes of FERPA are to ensure that parents have access to their children's educational records, protect the privacy rights of the parents and children by limiting access to those records without parent consent. Next, we'll look at some main causes for litigation and grievances. I've mentioned before in this class, previous Zoom sessions, this is an area that as the special education teacher, you want to do everything possible to prevent getting into litigation and dealing with grievances or due process. And so oftentimes FAPE, that free appropriate public education, is usually what is being litigated, and oftentimes due to compliance issues, such as each state mandates what must be an IEP and how those services are handled. And then also another significant factor is least restrictive environment. That is deciding where the child will receive services. And that's one of the most important decisions in which parents will take. So processes around IEPs are annual review, services provided, maintaining confidentiality so it is not breached, and then the methodology which instructions delivered. When we look at free and appropriate public education, those are educational expenses that are at public expense, under public supervision, and without charge to the parent. Must meet the standards of that state's educational agency, as well as the requirements of IDA law. It includes appropriate preschool, elementary, or secondary school education in that state. and are provided in the conformity with an individualized education program, and that meets federal requirements. IEPs and free appropriate public education must be free at no cost to the parent. Must be appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. The LEA or the school district is responsible for providing that free public education and also determining if a student needs to attend a private school for it. So here are some examples on when districts are obligated to fund that student's education, whether it be at the local district or outside that local district, and when parents can potentially collect tuition reimbursement from a public school if that child needs to attend a private setting to receive those specialized services. Here we're getting into some of the court cases that are focused on during week 6 and in which your weekly assignment will be centered around. So we have what we call the Rowley Standard. This is going back to 1982, and it's focusing on a court case dealing with free and appropriate public education. The Supreme Court in 1982 reviewed a court case dealing with the Board of Education at the Hendrick Hudson Central School District versus Rowley, and it sets forth determining how FAPE is determined. It's also referred to as the Rowley Standard. So determining whether the IEP that was developed was inadequate or adequate for compliance, and is it reasonably calculated to enable the student to receive some educational benefit? So some specific facts. Yeah, the Furnace Woods School refused to provide deaf student Amy Rowley with a sign language interpreter. Amy's parents sued the school for violation of Education of All Handicapped Children Act 1975. This act specifically requires that all schools accepting federal funds provide free and appropriate public education to all handicapped students. The district court ruled in Riley's favor, agreed that Amy Riley was not achieving her full potential, and she was unable to understand as much as she would have if she were provided a sign language interpreter. The next court case, looking at Andrew in 2017, student by the name of Drew was diagnosed with autism, ADHD, and is looking at the public school that Drew attended of Colorado. Beginning in second grade, Drew engaged in behavior in school that interfered more with learning. The school district developed no progress. Also, the school district repeated the same goals from year to year, never went in and changed IEP goals. So obviously, the student regressed. Before he began 5th grade, parents withdrew him and enrolled him in a private school. That private school developed a behavior intervention plan and addressed Drew's specific strengths and needs. Suddenly, Drew made significant academic progress. Parents then filed a complaint, school district seeking reimbursement for tuition payments to that private school. Claim was denied by the school district. Case began discussion on merely more than de minimis benefit is not enough. So it discussed prior decision of Rowley, pointed out that expressly declined to adopt a test for determined substantive adequacy. Also held that a student's IEP must aim to enable that student to make progress. Okay, so ultimately, the student was not making adequate progress, therefore, court ruled in favor to ensure that student was making ideal progress. And so the Andrews standard was to comply with FAPE standard, and it articulated in this case that IEP teams must develop, monitor, and revise goals as necessary to ensure they are appropriately individualized and that they are ambitious. IEP team must consider the child's present levels of achievement, their functional performance, their disability, and their potential for growth. IEP team must revisit those goals to make sure that they are progressing and revise as necessary to make sure they are receiving appropriate special education services and also related services. Just goes to remind everyone that it's important to revise those goals and that there is not a one size fits all. Basically, we can't continue to use the goals over and over each year without changing those. So if you look at the Andrews standard versus the Rowley, here's a comparison. One in 1982 compared to 17. You had a child that had a learning disability. Parents wanted that interpreter. Parents sued. IEP that allowed child to make minimal progress with some educational benefit. Then Andrew, child had autism, ADHD. Parents removed them, took them to a private school. All of a sudden, they made progress. Parents sued. That can give you an idea between the two court cases, just kind of compare and contrast. Least restrictive environment. Students with disabilities must receive their education alongside their peers without disabilities to the maximum extent that's appropriate. Maximum extent that's appropriate. That's kind of the key phrase or key term. Students should not be removed from the general education classroom unless learning cannot be achieved even with the use of supplementary aids. The term environment, least restrictive environment, can be interpreted to imply that LRE is a place or a location. It is not merely refer to a specific or particular setting. Rather, identifying LEA involves making program decisions about what services and supports a student needs to be successful and where and how those services and supports can be provided effectively. So when we're looking at a continuum of placement for services, here is a image showing your least restrictive, which would be your general education classroom, to the most restrictive, which would be a hospital setting or residential treatment facility. So we need to consider that the continuum of alternative placements when we're looking at least restrictive environment. Here it's talking about the Rachel H. 4-factor. So there are 4 factors. When we looked at a court case, it was in Redondo Beach Unified School District. Student was spending 75% of their day in the regular education classroom. Team wanted to go in, reduce that time to 44% as that student was entering the 5th grade. Okay. The parents went in, withdrew that student, hired a private tutor for one-on-one home instruction and filed due process. Okay, so they determined FAPE, but also free and appropriate education in least restrictive environment. So the 4H factor. Factor 1 is academic benefit received in the regular classroom versus the more restricted. Factor number 2, non-academic benefits of the least restrictive environment. Third factor, whether the student negatively affects education of their peers in the least restrictive environment. And the 4th factor, the expense of services and of course to keep the student in the least restrictive environment. So the court acknowledged that the very first factor deemed that to the most is in the regular classroom versus the more restrictive. So that's kind of a broad overview of the court cases that week 6 focuses on. So the assignment for this week is to go in and create a concept map or a Venn diagram showing the similarities and differences between the two laws, the Andrew decision versus the Rowley decision. So in creating that diagram or that concept map, make sure that you clearly and explicitly include explanation of the two laws, a description of how each law influences special education services, and a depiction of the chronological order of each of those court cases. Remember, we have 2 distinct years in which that was all ruled on and determined, and when we compare the two. Also, a description of how each law changed education. And the last area to make sure that you focus on in that Venn diagram or concept map is your reflection on the impact of both laws on educational setting and also specifically special education. So again, you can use any format to create those. You can Canvas or PowerPoint using a concept map or Venn diagramming or any other format that you prefer. And at least you have questions between now and when that assignment's due on Sunday, please feel free to email any questions you may have. And I check those in the morning and again in the evening. So hope you enjoy the rest of your week. And all goes well with the assignment. Again, reach out if you have questions. Thank you.